Thank you so much, Kim, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Erin Garrett, and I am an Energy and Environmental Stewardship Extension Educator, and I am based down in Southern Illinois. Today, we're going to be talking about warm season grasses, and this is a follow-up webinar to my cool season grass webinar, which I recorded a few months ago. That is on YouTube if you're interested in going back and viewing that one. So if you've been in some of my webinars before, you know my approach to grass identification is to keep things simple and to focus on tips and tricks that you can use when you're out in the field to help you identify grasses and tell them apart from one another. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop my video so that I'm not blocking any of the pictures on the screen today. So I always start these webinars by talking about what a grass is. So we go all the way back to the basics. So it's important to distinguish grasses from other plants that look similar to them, like sedges or rushes. So the first characteristic we can use to distinguish grasses is that they're monocots, okay? And this is in comparison to most of our flowering plants, which are called dicots. So we can tell that plants are a monocot using two main characteristics. The first is that they have one cotyledon or seed leaf when they start to germinate. So in this picture, you can see there are grass seeds that are starting to come out of the soil, and you can see that each grass has one individual leaf blade. Okay, if you compare this to a sunflower seed that's germinating below your bird feeders, you might notice that those have two cotyledons or seed leaves. Okay, so that would be a dicot. Monocots also have parallel veins in their leaves, and we can see that in this photo here. So in comparison to dicots that have a feather-like pattern, oftentimes in their leaf veins, grass veins run parallel. Grasses, unfortunately, do not have showy flowers, which makes them all the more challenging to identify. But you shouldn't just write off that characteristic and say we can't use grass flowers, because we can. Here's big blue stem and flower. It looks very different than our traditional dicot flowers, but we can still use these structures to tell them apart from one another. Grasses also have something called sheathing leaves. So what we typically think of as a leaf actually wraps around the stem and forms a structure called a sheath. And we'll look at that more closely in a few slides. And finally, grasses have hollow jointed stems. So you can find a joint, also called a node, along grass stems. I like to think of them as a kneecap, okay? And this will help you distinguish them from, again, sedges and rushes that are not jointed. If we focus on warm season grasses in particular, we use that term to describe grasses that emerge, develop, and flower in the summer and early fall. Okay, so they grow during warmer and drier parts of the year. Depending on where you're located in the US, we say, you know, late spring to summer to early fall, but more summer and fall is when most of that growth is happening, okay? And then these grasses will go dormant in the cooler winter months. So we distinguish warm season grasses from cool season grasses, which actively grow in the spring and early summer. And then we also have winter and summer annuals as well. Okay, so let's go a bit more in depth about the distinction between cool and warm season grasses. And the difference comes from the way that they undergo photosynthesis. Okay, so we're going to keep it simple, but essentially there's two main pathways in which plants can capture carbon dioxide to use in photosynthesis. Okay, so if we remember back to high school biology, carbon dioxide plus water combined with energy from the sun will give us sugar and oxygen. So there are two different pathways called C3 and C4 photosynthesis. Why do we call them that? The number 3 or 4 refers to the amount of carbon atoms present in the first molecule created in photosynthesis. So there's either 3 or 4. Cool season grasses use the C3 pathway, while warm season grasses use the C4 pathway. You can use those terms interchangeably, but I find it's easier to remember cool and warm rather than 3 and 4. So what does this mean practically? These different pathways allow grasses to be adapted to different environmental conditions, okay? So you can see a comparison here of some different characteristics. And essentially, warm season grasses have lower frost tolerance and moisture requirements than cool season grasses, and they have higher light and temperature requirements. Well, if we think about that, it makes sense that our cool season grasses would grow in the spring and our warm season grasses would grow in the summer. Let's compare two examples, Canada wild rye and big blue stem. Canada wild rye is a cool season C3 grass versus big blue, that's a warm season C4 grass. That rye will emerge in late winter or early spring, while big blue emerges late spring to summer. The timing of flowering and seeding is also staggered, with rye flowering in the spring to early summer and big blue in the summer to early fall. Rye will then go dormant in the summer, while big blue goes dormant during the winter. So as you go through our grasses today, our warm season grasses, you'll notice that most of them, not all, but most of them are native grasses, okay? So what I found is there appears to be a higher number of cool season grasses that are invasive or non-native, especially in our grassland or prairie ecosystems, because they're able to come in and grow in a time of the year when the warm season grasses aren't actively growing, okay? So there's a natural staggering of their life cycles that allows those non-native cool season grasses to establish where you already have a lot of warm season grasses already established and dominating in an area. Okay, now that we've laid the foundation of what a warm season grass is, let's review some basic grass ID terms that we're going to use throughout the rest of the webinar. And if you have that grass ID basics handout, it has a lot of the same information on it, so you can use that at a later time as well. So we can divide up a grass into vegetative structures and reproductive structures. So at the top is the inflorescence. That's the where we have the flower and the fruits. So we're going to skip that part for now, okay? We're going to look at the vegetative parts of the grass. So first up, we have a grass stem, and we're in luck because we can just call it a stem. Another term that you might hear is also a culm. Okay, so a stem or a culm. Along the stem, you find leaves, which are made up of 3 parts. A leaf has a blade, and then it forms a sheath where the blade wraps around the stem. Where that sheath ends, it forms that swelling or that joint that we call a node. Okay, so leaves have 3 parts, a blade, a sheath, and a node. And another term to point out is something called the collar region. The collar region is this area where the leaf blade becomes the leaf sheath, and there's some really great characteristics to look for in the collar region. So if we look on an actual grass, we have the stem here, the leaf blade. Here it becomes the sheath and wraps around the stem. I've pulled it back here so we can see the collar region. And one structure we look for in the collar region is something called a ligule. And that's this structure right here. So ligules are found in the collar region, and they are typically hairy or membranous. And it's a really great identification feature to look at. So oftentimes when I'm out identifying grasses, the first thing I do is I grab a leaf blade and I pull it back from the stem so that I can see if there's a ligule and what the ligule looks like. Okay. Here I have a few different examples of different types of hairy ligules. So this one has rather short hairs. You can see hairs on the leaf blade as well. Those are separate than the ligule. The ligule's right here, this upside down U-shaped structure. Here we have some dense long hairs in the ligule. Ligules can also be membranous. Okay, so here we have a short membranous ligule, and on this grass we have a much taller membranous ligule. When you're out looking early in the season, the ligules are often white or clear in color, but as they age throughout the season, throughout the summer, they often turn tan or brown, and they may even wither away. So ligules are a great identification structure early in the season, but they're not necessarily reliable as grasses age throughout the season. A grass doesn't have to have a ligule. If it doesn't, you often find a raised, smooth surface that doesn't have any hairs or membranes on it, okay? Most of the grasses we'll look at today, I think almost all of them have ligules, so not finding one is a good clue for you to notice. Okay, two other characteristics that are much less common, but very helpful if you see them, are something called auricles and horns, and you can also find them in the collar region. So an auricle is extra leafy material that looks like arms that wrap around or hug the stem, okay? As you pull that leaf blade back, you'd see those arms open up. You typically find auricles in ryegrasses, but that's not the only group of grasses where you'll find them. And then this other structure is something called horns. Horns are stiff U-shaped plant material that's an extension of the leaf sheath. There's only one grass that I've seen so far that has horns, and it's Indian grass. So if you find this structure in the collar region, it's a very reliable clue that you're looking at Indian grass. Okay, let's look at the reproductive structure of grasses. The inflorescence is the flowering head of a grass. Here, the stem becomes something called the rachis. From the rachis, you can have branches. And then the main flowering unit of the grass is called a spikelet. Okay, spikelets contain the flowers, and then the seeds will develop in the spikelet. There's a whole bunch of parts that you can find in a spikelet that have different names, like glooms and lemmas and paleas. I don't take identification down to the level of the spikelet because you often need a microscope. And there's a lot more terms that we'd have to learn. So for the purpose of this webinar, we're not going to get into those details. There's only one structure on the spikelet that we'll look at. Otherwise, we'll collectively call that flowering unit the spikelet. And then if the spikelets are held on a stalk, that stalk is called a pedicel. Oftentimes I just call it a stalk because it's easier to remember. Okay, there are three main types of inflorescences, and by asking ourselves a few simple questions, we can distinguish them from one another. So the first question we ask ourselves is, does the rachis, or that main stem of the inflorescence, does it branch? If it does, then we're looking at a panicle. Okay, so a panicle has a rachis that branches, and then the spikelets are either stalked or stalkless. So they're either held on a pedicel or they're not held on a pedicel. Okay, this sketch on the left is the most typical form of a panicle that you'll find. That's very open and airy and branched with spikelets held on the tips of pedicels. Okay, but this form over here is a little bit different. It might be difficult to tell that these are branches and not just a stalk, but we'll look at lots of examples today, and hopefully you'll start to get a feel for what these different inflorescences look like. Okay. If we go back to our first question, if our rachis is not branched, then we ask a second question. We will look and see if our spikelets are held on a stalk or not. If they are, it's called a raceme. If they're not, it's called a spike. Oftentimes what I do is I determine if I'm looking at a panicle or a spike, and if it's neither of those, then I say it's a raceme. A raceme is a little bit of a catch-all. It's kind of challenging to understand this definition, but again, we'll look at lots of examples. So here we have, right, an unbranched rachis, and we have spikelets held on little stalks or pedicels. Okay, but another very common form is to have this long finger-like collection of spikelets held together collectively on a small pedicel. Okay, it looks like these are branches, okay, and you could call this a panicle, but technically it is a raceme, so bear with me. And then the easiest one is if we have an unbranched rachis with spikelets attached directly to that rachis, we call it a spike. So let's look at what this looks like on some actual grasses. Here are a few examples of panicles. Okay, on the left, we can see that open, airy, branched inflorescence. So we have branches with little pedicels with our spikelets attached to them. Okay, here we have, this is purple top. Over here we have smooth brome. Again, we have a rachis that has short branches with spikelets on them. Next, we have some examples of racemes. The easy definition, right, is a spikelet on a little stalk that we can see in little blue stem. But then these collections of spikelets that are held on a short stalk here and here is another very common form of a raceme. So this is gamma grass up top and cordgrass down on the bottom. Okay, and finally our spikes. Our spikelets are directly attached to that rachis, bottlebrush grass. We've got a giant foxtail and a crested wheatgrass here. Sometimes it's difficult to see that they're directly attached to the stem, but you can simply pull off a few of those spikelets and see if they have a pedicel. And that's one easy way that I use to tell if it's a spike or a raceme. Okay. I said there's one structure on the spikelets that we're going to pay attention to, and that's something called an awn. So awns are an extension off of the tip of the spikelet. It looks kind of like a bristle, but a bristle is a separate structure. Okay. Awns come in different shapes and lengths and numbers off of each individual spikelet. You can see the diversity of awns in just these three pictures here. Indian grass has about a ½ inch long awn. Bottlebrush grass awns are much longer. Porcupine grass awns can be up to 7 inches long, and they curl when they dry to drive that spikelet or that seed down into the soil and plant it. Okay, so awns are pretty cool. They help prevent herbivory on these spikelets. And then in comparison, we have a bristle. Bristles are structures that are held on the bottom of the spikelet rather than emerging from the tip. And they're a separate structure than the spikelet itself. So here we can see there's a spikelet and it would sit inside of that nest of bristles, okay, emerging from the bottom. Bristles are very common in foxtails. And I don't think any of the grasses we look at today have bristles, but just to show you that difference between an awn and a bristle. All right, so that's our background information. We're going to dive into some warm season grass identification. We're going to cover 18 different species today. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first grass is side oats grama grass. This is a native grass that you can find in upland prairies, glades, and bluffs. And it's kind of scattered in its distribution throughout Illinois, weirdly through northern and southern Illinois, but kind of skipping most of central Illinois. It's one of 4 species found in its genus, the Bouteloua genus in Illinois. It's a more slender, thin grass that typically grows about 2 feet tall. However, down in southern Illinois, I've seen it grow up to 4 feet tall. So its height is going to depend on where you are located. Early in the summer, the leaves have hairs on the edges of them. We call that the leaf margin or the edge of the leaf. And those hairs are held on glands. So I know it's small in the photo, but hopefully you can see these kind of cream colored dots on the edge of the leaf. Those are glands, and then they each have a hair on them. Okay. The inflorescence that's produced is a raceme. Okay, so we have a collection of spikelets held on a small pedicel, and then the rachis itself is zigzag in shape. So we can really see that in this photo here, that we have a zigzag rachis. As the season progresses, you often find the inflorescences nodding to one side, which kind of lends to that name of side oats grama, because the spikelets will hold themselves off one side. You'll find this grass in flower midsummer to early fall. So again, here you can see this is the grass hanging off to one side and the spikelets all hanging off one side. In the bottom, I put in this picture of side oats in bloom. So these are the reproductive structures of a grass. We have the anthers here and the stigmas here. Okay, again, not terms that we need to remember, just we'll point it out in some of the pictures that we see today. And oftentimes they're brightly colored, so bright red in side oats grama for those anthers. The leaves are not really much to write home about, rather small in size, but again, look for those hairs on those glands early in the season. Okay, prairie cordgrass is next. It is the only species in the Spartina genus in Illinois, and you can see it's found in nearly every county throughout the state. It prefers wet prairies and marshes, but I have seen it growing in some drier areas as well. And I often see it growing on roadsides. This is one of many grasses we'll talk about today that has very sharp leaves that can cut you if you're not careful. So definitely do not walk through a patch of prairie cordgrass in shorts. I don't recommend you walking through a patch of grass in shorts anyways, but this one can definitely give you some pretty nasty cuts. The leaves have a pretty prominent midrib. You can kind of see it in this photo here. And they curve to the side and taper to a sharp point. So you can kind of see that in this picture here. The ligule on this grass is a fringe of hairs. And then it has spikelets arranged in a raceme that's 1 to 4 inches long. You can see that stalk or pedicel holding that collection of spikelets, and it will bloom in midsummer to early fall. Okay, so again, we can see in the collar region what that grass looks like, and then you can see the really long leaves that taper to a fine point, but they take a really long time to taper to that point. So that's a little bit different of a leaf structure than the other grasses we'll see today. Okay, Indian grass is next, and it's one of the 3 dominant tallgrass prairie species that we have in Illinois. It is the only species in its genus, the Sorghastrum genus, in our state, and it is found in every county. It's a native grass and can be found mostly in prairies, savannas, and glades, but I, at least down in southern Illinois, see it growing on the roadsides as well when I'm driving on the highway. It's a rather robust grass that can grow up to 7 feet tall. And the color of this grass is very distinctive because it's very blue-green. I don't typically look at the different shades of greens in grasses, but this one definitely has a blue-gray tone that helps it stand out from the rest of the vegetation. You can kind of see the grayer blue-green color in this photo here. The leaves have a prominent white midrib as well. And you should be able to find velvety hairs on its nodes, so its kneecaps. This is that one grass that, remember, has the horns. So that's that stiff U-shaped material. And it also has a membranous ligule. So in this photo, it's later in the season, so it's browned with age, but there is that ligule present there as well. And then the inflorescence is a panicle of golden orange, very silky textured on spikelets, and you'll find it blooming late summer to early fall. In this photo, again, you can see the anthers, which are yellow. So it's a very pretty grass when it's in bloom. And it is often found in bunches as well. So you can see that structure here. Okay, switchgrass is next, and it's another popular prairie grass found in nearly every county in Illinois. It's native, found in prairies, bluffs, savannas, and glades. And it is a bunch grass that grows about 6 feet tall. The leaves on this also have a prominent midrib like Indian grass. Okay, and the leaves curl very tightly when the grass senesces or when it dies. Okay, so when we get into early fall, I start to look for dried curled leaves held against the stem in a big robust bunch grass, and that helps me identify it as switchgrass. Okay, early in the season, it has a hairy ligule, and it also has a very strong triangle-shaped collection of hairs in the collar region at the base of the leaf blade. So you can see hairs all up the leaf blade as well, but then it has this really, it's hard to tell on this picture, but it does have a very distinctive triangular-shaped collection of hairs in addition to a hairy ligule. Okay. The inflorescence is a broad spreading panicle with reddish spikelets, and the panicle itself can be 1 to 1.5 feet tall, so very large inflorescence. And it will bloom in midsummer for about 2 weeks. Okay, we get a close-up of the spikelets here. We can see that they do not have an awn. That will be important to distinguish it from another grass later on. Here you can kind of see a little bit more of that triangular shaped cluster of hairs. And again, down here, we can see that big, broad, open panicle of spikelets. Okay, little blue stem is another popular prairie grass, and it can be found in prairies, bluffs, glades, and savannas as well. It is a thin, more delicate bunch grass, and it grows between 2 and 3 feet tall, which will help distinguish it from broom sedge, which is our next grass, which looks very similar, but is much more robust. So the stems of little blue stem are flattened, kind of football shaped. They don't roll in your finger very easily. And they're often reddish in color. You can see that in the photo to the right. So oftentimes plants that are named blue have red tones to them. The leaves are thin and pretty sparse along the branches. It does have a short membranous ligule. And then what we see is a raceme inflorescence with fluffy white spikelets that look like eyelashes, and they're pretty small compared to broom sedge, which we'll see in a few slides. Little blue blooms late summer into fall. Okay, so again, you can kind of see the small size of these spikelets. It is a bunch grass, and we see that red color very prominently on the stems in these pictures. Okay, so keep that image of little blue in your mind. Now we're going to look at broom sedge. Broom sedge is not a sedge, it's a grass. So this is one of those common names that might throw you for a loop at first. It is a native grass, and it can be found in prairies, pastures, and more disturbed areas. So it's not necessarily always considered the most desirable grass, but it is native. Typically, it grows between 1.5 to 3 feet tall, but again, down in Southern Illinois, I've seen it up to 5 feet tall. And it typically can tolerate poorer or more disturbed site conditions than little blue stem. So looking at habitat can be helpful when distinguishing between those two grasses as well. It's a bushy bunch grass that turns golden orange in the fall. It has flattened stems just like little blue, but hopefully you can see broom sedge is much leafier and bushier than little blue stem. So it's just a much more robust grass, and it tends to be more green rather than red, right? We see a lot of green. We do see some red color, but it's a much greener grass. And then we'll turn that golden orange color, but not so much red, right? Like in little blue, okay? It has hairs at the base of its leaves and in the collar region, and it does have a membranous ligule. It's this brown structure in this photo here. You can see all those hairs on the leaves here. Its racemes are fluffy, feathery spikelets that are larger than those on little blue. Okay, so in size comparison, we'll see this much larger spikelet here, and you can see them on this grass here as well. Okay, here again, I included this close up just so you can see the anthers on broom sedge are red to pink in color, and then you can see the stigmas as well in that grass flower. So typically when comparing between broom sedge and little blue, I look at the robustness of the grass, how leafy it is, and where it's growing. And broom sedge is also going to bloom late summer to early fall at the same time as little blue. Okay, our next grass is big blue stem, and despite the common names, if you've been paying attention to the Latin, big blue stem is more closely related to broom sedge than it is to little blue stem. That's your fun fact of the day. Big blue is native to Illinois, and it is actually our state grass. Yes, we have a state grass, and big blue stem won the vote. It's the third dominant tall grass prairie species, and you can find it in prairie savannas and glades. Typically, when you say prairie and tall grass prairie, big blue stem is the grass that comes to a lot of people's minds. Okay, it can grow up to 8 feet tall, and its stems are flattened, just like broom sedge and little blue stem, and often reddish in color. It can get a bit confusing because the leaf sheaths are green, and they cover the majority of the stem. but you can see here we have a red stem. So you just have to look carefully to make sure you're looking at the stem and not the leaf sheath. Okay. Speaking of the sheath and the base of the leaf blade can have some sparse hairs on it. And it does have a membranous ligule. So we see those hairs here, and we see that membranous ligule here. The inflorescence is a raceme, but oftentimes you hear people describe it as a turkey foot shaped inflorescence. And that explains the other common name for this grass, which is turkey foot. So the spikelets of the raceme are often reddish in color. In this photo, they look a little purple. And it will bloom in late summer to early fall. Okay. So another view of the collar region where we can see that membrane and those hairs. In the middle picture, we have kind of that typical outline of what big blue stem looks like in the distance with that turkey foot. And then again in the right, sometimes you have such a large stand of big blue stem growing that you can't tell that it's a bunch grass, but it is indeed a bunch grass. So this picture really isolates it and shows that characteristic. Okay, purple top is our next grass, also native, found in savannas, fields, and woodland borders. And in a couple weeks, I tend to really notice it growing on the roadsides, and it can be found in nearly every county in Illinois. So purple top will grow 3 to 5 feet tall, and it has very dense velvety hairs that you can find on the nodes and on the outside of the collar region. So essentially what that means is if you lifted up the leaf blade and looked at the base of the leaf blade on the outside, you'd find velvety hairs there. There isn't really any other grass that we look in that spot for that characteristic, at least in the webinar today. So rather than pulling the leaf blade back and looking on the inside for that ligule, if you pulled the leaf blade up and looked underneath, you'd find velvety hairs here. Okay. It has a panicle inflorescence that's very open and airy. And in the middle picture, you can see that those branches droop at the tips. And that's a very characteristic shape for purple top. Okay. When I'm out hiking, I love to entice my participants on the hike to run their hand down the panicle of spikelets to trick them, because the other common name for this grass is grease grass. So the spikelets are very oily. So they're purple in color and very oily to the touch. And it's also known as grease grass. Okay. There is another species in this genus in Illinois, but its panicle is more spike-like, so you shouldn't confuse them very easily. And oftentimes, like I said, I can see it growing on the roadside, and you can tell this grass because the spikelets look almost black in color because of that deep purple color that they have. So it's a pretty distinctive grass to find. And it blooms midsummer to early fall. So right about now to a couple weeks from now, we should start to see that one in bloom. Okay, prairie dropseed is next, and it's one of 9 species in its genus in Illinois. It is a native grass found in prairies and limestone glades. It's a bit more scattered in its distribution throughout the state. And it is a bunch grass, and it has dense tufts of narrow leaves that you can see in the top right photo. So it typically only grows 1 to 2 feet tall. And the leaves have short hairs in the collar region, and then it has a fringed membrane as well. The panicle of this grass is more contracted and narrow than other panicles we've looked at, right? It's not large and open and airy. The branches are held much more close to the rachis, and they're shorter, okay? So it makes a denser panicle. This is a very popular landscape plant. I actually added quite a few prairie drop seeds to my garden this year, and they're doing really well. They just started to flower, so I'm pretty excited about those. They flower in midsummer to early fall. Okay, we have another grass with purple in the name, purple love grass. This is one of 15 species. in its genus in Illinois. So there's 15 different love grasses. Okay. It's a native found in prairies, savannas, and more disturbed sandy areas. So again, this is one that you'd often find in less desirable areas or on roadsides as well. With its distribution across every county in Illinois, we can expect that. It is a bunch grass, and it typically only grows about 1 to 2 feet tall. And what's interesting about this grass is its inflorescence usually makes up at least half of the overall height. So you can't really tell in these photos, but the ground is right here and the leaves are only, say, 4 or 5 inches off the ground, and then the inflorescence makes up the rest of the height of that grass. It does have a ligule of long white hairs. I don't have a picture of the ligule on this one. And then that large open panicle has purple elongated spikelets. And if you look close, you can see what looks like small V-shaped scales stacked on top of one another. Okay. Another name for this grass is tumblegrass because the inflorescence, when it's mature, can break off and tumble away to help spread those seeds. Okay. And it blooms late summer to early fall. So this one has a much more densely packed inflorescence, and it's a lot shorter than purple top. So that should help you tell those two grasses with purple spikelets apart from one another. Okay, next up is gamma grass. This is probably one of my favorite grasses. And I say that a lot, but gamma grass is the only grass found in its genus in our state. And it can be found in moist areas, prairies, and savannas. It can grow 3 to 7 feet tall and is a very robust bunch grass with an interesting growth habit because the leaves in the bunch are held strongly away from the center of the bunch as it ages through the season. So you can kind of see in this photo on the right, it looks like a deer has come and bedded down in the middle of this bunch, but that's just the natural grass growth form, of this grass. It pushes those leaves and holds them strongly out from the middle. Okay. This is another one of those grasses with extremely sharp leaves. So don't run your hand backwards against the grain of the grass because it will cut you. Again, we can see a very prominent white midrib, just like in Indian grass. And then it produces a raceme that has a collection of spikelets that are individually 4 to 12 inches long. Okay. And the racemes are held in the same arrangement as big blue stem, like a turkey foot. Okay. So the first time I saw this grass, I thought I had found a strange mutant version of big blue stem. And then I came to find out that it was a completely separate grass. In this grass, the flowers are really interesting because they're monoecious. So what that means is you have separate male and female flowers, but they're found on the same plant. Okay, so here we can find the female spikelets or flowers at the bottom of the grass. So down here, we see the stigmas of the female flowers. And then up top in the top 3/4, we have the male flowers, which are the anthers. Okay. So I just find that the grass flower really cool and gamma grass. It blooms in summer in our state. And here are some additional pictures. You can really see that turkey foot shape in the center picture. Here's a close-up of the stigmas and then the anthers up top. And then early in the season, this is what that bunch grass looks like. So it doesn't have that strong flattened part in the middle yet. So that can make it difficult to tell it apart from some other grasses early in the season. And it's kind of a wait and see for that habit to develop as it continues to grow. Okay, giant cane is next. And it's a native species of bamboo found in bottomland forest swamps and along rivers, found in southern Illinois, and it's the only native woody grass in our area. So simply looking at the stem and seeing that bamboo appearance is enough for most people to identify it. If you look closer, it does have hairy ligules. And giant cane is interesting because it grows in usually pretty large colonies, and the individual plants will flower only once in their lifetime, and it can take about 10 to 20 years for them to mature enough to flower. And then after flowering, they will die. You can find giant cane blooming in spring or summer. This one's a little bit different. Sometimes warm season and cool season grasses don't always follow the rules. So this one you can find blooming earlier in the spring as well. Okay, our next three grasses are easy to confuse, at least for myself. So we're gonna compare them to each other. First is nimblewill. It's often misnamed nimbleweed, but it is nimblewill. Will is the second half of the name. And it's one of 14 different muley grasses in our state. So it is a native grass, and you can find it in woodlands, but also in shaded lawns and disturbed areas like power line clearances, where I found a huge monoculture of this growing. So one of its most distinctive features is the way that it holds its leaves out from the stem. So they're held straight out perpendicular, and you can see that in the leftmost picture. It likes to grow in colonies, but it's not rhizomatous. Okay, so the root system is not rhizomatous. But one way you can distinguish it from the next grass we'll look at is that the lowered nodes, right, those kneecaps of the grass, will, when they touch the soil, they will reroot in the soil. So if you gently tugged on the base of this grass and the lower nodes pulled out of the ground because they had rooted, that's one way to give you a clue that you're looking at nimblewill. It produces a narrow panicle, and then its spikelets have awns on them, and you can find it blooming midsummer to early fall. In comparison, we have another muley grass in the same genus. So it's also native and typically found more exclusively in woodlands rather than in lawns or disturbed areas. And this one is rhizomatous, and you'll not find it rooting at the lower nodes. When they're young, the way that they hold their leaves from the stem looks very similar. So you can see how those leaves are held kind of straight out. However, the leaves are slightly larger in muley grass than nimblewill. So that's one way to tell them apart. But it's difficult if you don't have them side by side to make that size judgment. Okay. The inflorescence is going to be a big clue because it's a spike rather than a panicle. And it has tiny round spikelets on it that do not have awns. Okay, so midsummer to early fall, you can find the inflorescence. So without the flowering structures, these two muley grasses are difficult to tell apart, but if you do have the inflorescences, it makes it much easier. Okay, and the third lookalike grass that is the most distinctive of them is called whitegrass. So it's one of 3 species in its genus in our state that are also called the cut grasses. So this native grass can be found in woodlands and along partially shaded wetlands. It has a very distinctive growth habit that once you see it, it's difficult to forget. So the leaves are rather thin, wispy, and I would describe their growth habit as clumpy. So they form masses of these leaves that kind of droop to the ground, okay? I think I might have a better picture on the next slide. So whereas the last 2 grasses held their leaves very stiffly out to the side, these are more relaxed, okay? If we look at the nodes of the grass, they are hairy as well. And then it produces a panicle inflorescence that has spikelets that fold in half around the branches, which is another great way to distinguish it if you're able to find one with the inflorescence. So these spikelets, if you were in person and maybe had a hand lens, you could see that they're wrapped and folded around that branch. It blooms in midsummer to early fall. Okay, next is beaked panic grass. And it's one of 13 panicum grasses in our state. So it's called beaked panic grass. We have other panic grasses that are in a different genus, the Dicanthelium genus, and those are cool season grasses. So this is a separate group of grasses. This grass is native and found in old fields and disturbed areas, mostly in southern Illinois. Its leaves have very short hairs on them, and then it has a leaf sheath that is also hairy, and we would describe the sheath as being keeled. We can't see it in this photo here, but a keeled leaf sheath means it looks like it's been folded in half like a piece of paper, and it retains that crease down the leaf sheath itself, okay? The grass has a panicle inflorescence, And it has long, more football-shaped spikelets, and oftentimes they're reddish or purple in color, and you can find it blooming midsummer to early fall. All right, common reed or Phragmites is next, and common reed is an Illinois invasive plant of concern. You can find it in wet areas, swamps, and marshes, and the location I usually find it is on highway roadsides. It is our most robust grass that we'll cover today, easily surpassing 10 feet in height and can get up to even 15 feet tall. If you look at the leaves, they're much larger, broader than other leaves we'll look at, and they have a crimp in them as well. The ligule is a fringe of hairs, and then it produces an inflorescence that is a very large purple panicle. We can see in the center picture, and over the winter it turns brown. So it's a particularly aggressive invasive species because any fragment of this plant can root and continue growing and spreading. You'll find it blooming from mid to late summer, and maybe a more typical picture of this grass we can see in this photo here. If you're near any wetland or on the roadside, you have more than likely seen this grass growing. Okay, I believe this is our last grass for today, Johnson grass. It is another Illinois invasive plant of concern, so it's also listed as a noxious weed in Illinois. You can find Johnson grass growing in pastures, roadsides, and prairie restorations. It is a large, robust bunch grass that can grow up to 7 feet tall. This is another one that, because of how dense it's usually growing where you find it growing, it doesn't really appear to be a bunch grass, but it is indeed. It has very sharp leaves that have a prominent white midrib. Does this sound familiar? We have a robust bunch grass, sharp leaves, white midrib. This sounds like gamma grass as well, okay? Looks very different when it's in flower, but when it's young, they look extremely similar. Let's see, the ligule in Johnson grass is made up of velvety hairs, okay? And then it produces a large open panicle with reddish spikelets that have awns on them, okay? It can be kind of difficult to see the awns, but we can hopefully see them in this photo here, okay? It will bloom in midsummer to fall, okay? So early in the season, gamma grass and Johnson grass look very similar. You can look for this velvety ligule to try to help tell them apart. But if you're looking to treat Johnson grass and leave gamma grass alone, you may need to wait to look for that growth habit of the gamma grass looking like it's matted down in the center. Okay. When they're in bloom, Johnson grass and switchgrass look very similar. Okay, because they have that open, airy inflorescence. However, switchgrass spikelets do not have awns, and Johnson grass spikelets do have awns. Okay, and then switchgrass is much more open in area of a panicle. It's not as densely packed with spikelets as Johnson grass is. Okay, one other characteristic on Johnson grass is the stems are something called glaucous. Okay. Glaucous means that the stem is covered with a whitish substance that you can rub off. So here you can see this white powder, and then here is the portion of the stem where I've rubbed it off with my finger, okay? So that's another test that you can do to see that you're looking at Johnson grass. Later in the season, I typically look for all these red and brown spots that develop on Johnson grass. Even if it hasn't been sprayed with a chemical, it looks very sick and like it has been. So not that necessarily the most reliable characteristic, but that is something that I will look for to help tell that I'm looking at Johnson grass. Okay, when we look at identifying a grass, there's a lot of different places we could start. At this time of the year, for looking at warm season grasses, if we have an inflorescence, that's where we want to start. So we can determine what type of inflorescence we have. Is it a panicle, a spike, or a raceme? We can look to see if there are awns, how long they are, if we just have one awn per spikelet, if we have any different colors. We can also look for color on the inflorescence. If we don't have an inflorescence or we need some extra help, we can look at leaf characteristics like that ligule, looking for auricles, and then looking for any hairs as well and where we can find them. So we looked at a few grasses that had hairs just on the edges or at the base of the leaf blade or on the outside of the leaf blade as well. Okay. When it comes to the resources that I use most often my technical plant identification key, which is not beginner friendly. So if you really get into plant terminology, I would recommend Molenbrock's Vascular Flora. But for a beginner, I use Illinois Wildflowers website. There is a wealth of information there, and I believe there is an app as well that you can use. And then the Grass ID book that I started with is Grasses by Lauren Brown. It has sketches in it rather than pictures, but oftentimes that's a really great place to start for beginners as well. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We would appreciate any feedback you would like to give on today's webinar. So we do have an evaluation that you can either scan the QR code on the screen or type in go.illinois.edu/warm season grass eval. I believe Kim is going to put that in the chat box for us as well. And you will receive a follow-up email with that information after the webinar today. So Kim, I think I did okay on my time. And if we have any questions, I will go ahead and see if I can answer those now.
Great, thank you so much for delivering an amazing presentation. And I have been addressing some of the questions in our chat box. Let me pull up ones that still need to be addressed.
Great.
First, do you know about grasses with their reproduction? Are grasses usually outcrossers?
That's a great question. I wouldn't know off the top of my head. I know some that I've read about do have mechanisms to be able to self-fertilize as well. But my guess just off the top of my head is their preference is that cross-pollination and outcrossing is their number one mechanism for most of them. But again, that's just me making a guess.
Yeah, I would have to look that up for particular species as well. Another question that came in, what is the first and second dominant grass in Illinois prairies? The way I answered the question was, in my experience, dominant grasses range widely depending on your location and system. In some cases, it could even be non-native species. For native species, I put Indian grass, switchgrass, and big blue stem are usually dominant in northern Illinois prairies.
Yes. I agree with that. Yeah, big blue and Indian grass. If we're looking at what are the dominant tall grass prairie species. But again, yes, you're right, Kim. It depends on where you're looking, because I've been to prairie restorations where the dominant grass was smooth brome, which is non-native. So it just kind of depends. But if we're taking more of that, you know, if we just look at the natives, yeah, big blue and Indian grass.
Another question came in, how is zebra grass and Japanese strip grass classified? And I wasn't familiar with both of those.
As a cool season or a warm season grass?
Yes.
I'm guessing. Those are zebra grasses and miscanthus. So I'm not sure off the top of my head. Seeing as those are more ornamental grasses, I'm not as familiar with them. But I'm sure a quick internet search could help provide that answer for you.
The other things that we talked about, landscaping grasses with distinct odor is that prairie dropseed. That's a really fun one. I've worked with prairie dropseed before. The flowers are very fragrant, and so are the seeds. Some people say that they smell like cilantro or coriander. I definitely think it smells like buttered popcorn. Someone asked the question about ranked leaves, and so I pulled up information online. It's a plant term, and it talks about when you're sighting along the branch of a stem from the tip end, if it appears there are 2 rows of leaves, either opposite or alternate, the branch is 2 raked. If there are 3 rows, it is 3 ranked. Someone asked a question about removing Phragmites, and I provided a few guides about invasive species. We were also wondering what distinguishing field marks were out there to determine invasive Phragmites from our native species. There was some good commentary going on in the chat. I provided some information, and at the same time, it is true there are hybrids. So it is a difficult question to answer. There was a question, can you re-show the grass after the white grass slide, please? I think somebody just wanted to take a peek at those slides one more time.
Yep. And
the last question that we had was, will your slide deck be shared with the public?
So the complete slide deck will not be. I have put together just the warm season grass profiles. That is a handout that you received in an email, and I will send it again with the evaluation. And the majority of the terminology information is included in the Grass ID Basics handout. And to circle back to the question about the zebra grass, if it's in the Miscanthus genus, it's a warm season grass.
Thank you. So we still have 3 minutes to 3. Does anybody else have any last minute questions? I'm looking through our chat one last time, but feel free to type in a question. Will there be a field presentation for warm season grasses?
There is. So for those of you that are located in Southern Illinois, I am doing a warm season grass ID hike at Giant City State Park, and that is on September 2nd. It is limited in number, so if you're interested, sign up for that. Occurs through Giant City, so you can call the visitor center to sign up for that program.
And I am going to look that information up and put it in the chat for you. One last question. Can you talk anything about fountain grass?
She say that, was it fountain grass? Is that what you said?
Fountain grass, yes.
That is not one that I am familiar with. Again, most of my, let me see. That one, so that one's a non-native and C4, so it's a warm season grass, and it's a bunch grass, and that's about the extent of what I know about fountain grass.
Okay, and one last question: do you plan in the future to do any lectures on invasive grasses?
So I have done a nuisance grass webinar that is recorded. It included non-native and invasive grasses, and that is on U of I Extension's YouTube channel. So one just on invasive, separate than that, probably not. I will probably be putting together a summer and winter annual grass ID webinar to come next year.
All right. Well, thanks. We want to be respectful of everybody's time today. So thank you for attending this webinar, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.